Welcome back, everyone, to more Forza Motorsport 7 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Now, I am particularly excited about today's video because we're going to be talking about wheel settings. Now, normally you might think, what in the world would excite you about talking about wheel settings of all things? Normally you want to be talking about setups or lap times or which car you just purchased. But wheel settings, in my opinion, are the key to everything in this game. The first part of my experience with this game, when I got started in the career mode and driving some of the cars I had access to, was terrible because the default wheel settings are no good, in my opinion. So we got to get the wheel settings right, and that's what this video is about. Now, a couple of things to get out of the way at the beginning as we take a look at my new Lamborghini that I just purchased. A couple of things we need to get out of the way. First, I have played this game on both. I have it loaded both on my Xbox One as well as my PC. Right now, we're looking at the PC version, but I'm using the same settings on both, so that shouldn't be an issue. Also, I'm using a Logitech G920 wheel, and that feels pretty similar between the PC and the Xbox One edition as well. Also, I will say that probably the Xbox One force feedback is a little bit less, but again, that could be all just in my head, but it seems a little bit less to me. I would say that these wheel settings would be similar across different types of wheels, but I do want to let you know that I'm using the Logitech G920 wheel, just so you'll have that for a frame of reference. Once we start taking a look at the individual settings, we'll talk about any differences that there are between the Xbox and the PC settings, as well as maybe some different settings that would apply to different wheels. All right, so without any further ado, let's talk about those wheel settings. Now, we've got a couple of different ways we can get there. We can go up to progress, click there, and then go to options, or we can come down to the bottom right-hand corner and simply click on the options menu. When the option menu pops up, we're going to go to the bottom left and we're going to click on controller. Now, we're going to have some different options here. What we want is the middle one. We want the input options. Now, normally here it would say, for me, it would say the Logitech G920 here, but since I've made a few adjustments, it now says custom. But what we're interested in is on the advanced screen, which is at the bottom part of the screen. So we're going to click on advanced, and that brings us to where all the magic happens in Forza. We're going to start from the top, and we're going to work our way down and talk about any differences that there might be between PC, Xbox, and between different wheels, and so forth. Starting with the steering axis, we have two options. We have the dead zone inside and dead zone outside. Now, this is very simple. I see no reason not to use 0 and 100 on these two settings. The reason is, if you use anything other than 0 here, if I move this up to 3, 5, 1, anything other than 0, I'm going to get a dead zone right in the center of the steering, and I don't want that. So I want 0 here. Also, I don't see any reason to use anything other than 100 on the dead zone for the outside, and that's because by using 100, that's 100% of the wheel's rotation, which in my case is 900 degrees. So I want all of that. There will be another way to adjust that a little farther down. So 0 and 100, I really don't know of any reasons why you wouldn't use that. Moving on down to acceleration, we have the same two options here, dead zone inside and dead zone outside. Now here, I have chosen not to use 0, and that's just personal preference. There's absolutely no problem with using 0 here as well. The reason I've used 5 is because on 5, it allows me to set my foot up against and sort of rest it up against the pedal without it triggering maybe that I'm using the gas just a little bit and trying to accelerate. So it gives me just a little bit of margin for error. But again, feel free to go down and use 0 if you so choose, or maybe 1 or 2 or something like that. No problem there as well. Now comes to one of my most important settings outside of the force feedback that we'll look at just in a second. And that is the dead zone outside. This is where, how much of the complete throw or travel of the pedal do you want to use? In other words, when do you want to get to maximum throttle? And of course, you could use 100 and say, I want maximum throttle at the very end of the travel of the pedal. Well, for me, I don't want quite that much. So I bring it back to about 95. And the reason I do that is I've noticed that the pedals on the G920 sometimes don't measure that full 100% throttle. So I back this off to about 95 to ensure that whenever I've got my foot to the floor, I'm actually getting full throttle. So that's, again, your experience may vary depending on your pedal set, but for me, just to leave a little bit of a margin for error to make sure I'm getting to full throttle, I bring this back to 95. Now the same thing, deceleration or the brakes, I do the same thing here, moving this to 5. But again, if you want to use this down at 0, that's no problem at all. I use just a little bit of a margin for error, again, so that I can rest my foot up against the brake pedal without it always registering that I'm using at least a little bit of brake. So again, feel free to adjust this, and going back to 0 is definitely not a problem. Now, deceleration, what do I normally use? Anything between 95 and 100 is pretty good for me. I'm not so much worried about getting full brake travel and full 100% brake as I am the throttle. So I'll use anywhere between 95 and 100 here, and really is not much of a difference. Now, personally, I don't use the clutch, so I skip by these, but the same principles applied as what we used for acceleration and deceleration, except for the idea that with the clutch, we're not going to be using it, but for very, very briefly. So essentially, you might want to say, give yourself a little bit of change to the dead zone, maybe 5 or maybe even more to like 10. And then that way, as soon as you hit the clutch, it will register and you can move on. Handbrake, I don't use the handbrake, so you can see there is a huge dead zone here on the outside, but I'm not familiar with the handbrake. I don't use it, so I move on. Now we get to the fun stuff, the stuff that's really going to have a huge effect on how the wheel feels to you in the game. We'll start with the vibration scale. The vibration scale goes 0 to 100, and what this affects is primarily what I've noticed is when you're going over the curbs. If you're going over the curbs, you know, sometimes at particular tracks, depending on the shape of the curb, if they use that sawtooth type curb, then you're going to feel a lot of vibration. This is the thing that makes your desk shake uncontrollably whenever you hit it. Well, that's why I've backed this down to 75. I didn't want the full experience because, particularly in my experience at Watkins Glen, if you use those curbs at Watkins Glen, then it almost shakes everything off my desk. So I've backed it down a little bit there. Otherwise, I haven't noticed that it affects very much else. Maybe if you get off track, some of those forces as well, but I'm not looking so much for the vibration. So again, back that off of 100 just a little bit. Force feedback scale, I want this all the way at 100 because any way that we want to reduce the force feedback, we can do with other options below. So I keep this always maxed out at 100. I want all the force feedback that the game can give me. Steering sensitivity. This is one thing that would be different if you're on the Xbox versus the PC. Since I'm on the PC, it says steering sensitivity, and I have it all the way at 100. Now, if you're on the Xbox, this is going to say wheel rotation angle, and it's going to tell you from the minimum up to whatever your rotation is for your particular wheel. If I was on the Xbox, it would show me 900 right here. That would be full. I want this maxed out. For me, that's the only way I can run it. If I reduce this to a lower number, then the steering starts to feel really bland, and it almost just like it's almost dead feeling that I get. So I have to run this at 100. Now, there's some other things that you can do to adjust the steering, so I like to leave this maxed out. But again, now I know in previous games I've had to reduce this down. For instance, I know I had to go from 900 to about something along the lines of 540, maybe into the 400s or so in Forza Horizon 3, but not so for me in this game. Now we move on to steering linearity, and 50 on steering linearity, which would be the default, is intended to be a one-to-one movement of your wheel. And what that means very simply is if I turn the steering wheel 90 degrees to the left, then that means that the steering wheel in the game should also turn 90 degrees to the left. So it's a one-to-one ratio. Well, for me, that the 50 setting felt a little bit too twitchy and almost like it was a little bit more than one-to-one, meaning that if I turn my steering wheel 90 degrees to the left, then the steering wheel in the game turned maybe 95 or 100 degrees to the left. Your results may vary, but for me, it just didn't feel quite right, so I've reduced it a little bit. And I can tell you that it doesn't take much to get results on this, so you don't necessarily have to go from 50 all the way down to 40 or 30 or something. Just from 50 to 45 would be a huge change. So again, play around with this to make the steering either more sensitive, which would be an increase above 50, 53, 55, and so on, would make the steering more sensitive, and then dropping it below 50 would make it less sensitive, which is what I've done. Moving on to the force feedback understeer, which oddly enough seems to be the most important setting here. and it's completely opposite of what I thought it was going to be. Now, the max here is at 200, and I would have thought that force feedback maximum would have given me the most force feedback, but it turns out I've actually seen it be the opposite. If I put this maximum on 200, then what I notice is I get very little force feedback out of the wheel. If I want the maximum amount of force feedback, then I want this understeer value at the minimum, which turns out to be 5. So this will give you the maximum, and if you feel like that's too much, then of course you simply increase this number until it feels about right to you, but I'm sticking with the maximum because I want the heaviest wheel I can get. The same thing applies to the force feedback minimum force. Now again, this makes no sense to me whatsoever because it would seem to me that I would want to max this out. And in fact, when I first started testing these things out, I had tons of frustration and was getting very little force feedback because one of the things I was doing was maxing this out as well as this. So it made for very little force feedback. It wasn't until I started testing out the minimum value here that things really started to come alive between these two settings. So you want to make sure that you have this at its minimum. Again, that would give you the strongest, but if that's too much for you, if you want to reduce that, then increase from there. Now, if we move down to the wheel damper scale and the center spring scale, I admit these two things, I have not noticed a huge change either way. The wheel damper scale, this gives me the heaviest feel. Again, that's completely opposite of what I was expecting. But for me, this gave me the best number using the minimum of 0. But of course, as always, feel free to test out halfway in between or fully maxed out and see how that works out for you. I'm sure it's also going to be different between wheels and between cars that you're driving. The feel might be a little different. But for me, it works best at the minimum setting. Same thing goes for the center spring scale. For me, I am so far using 100, but I have also used the minimum here and have not seen a huge change. Now, again, could have been simply differences in cars and so forth, but for me, these are the settings that have worked out best for me, and I'm hoping that they can help relieve some of the frustration and you don't have to go through as much frustration as I have in testing these different settings out until I finally could get with something that I enjoyed. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. One thing I will do is as I continue to play the game, if I have any updates to these settings that I find work better, then I will include them in the video description just below. But by placing any questions or comments you have in the comment section, either myself or somebody else who has knowledge can help you out because that's the goal. We want maximum enjoyment from the game for everybody. And so far, this is what's giving me that best enjoyment, and hopefully it will help you along as well. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video, and stay tuned for more Forza Motorsport 7 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming.